The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of southern Nigeria, stretches outward in long, slow swells. The shoreline of the Niger Delta breaks into creeks and mangroves before meeting open water. Beyond that, the Gulf of Guinea widens into working sea lanes where commercial vessels move in steady patterns. Oil platforms stand fixed above the seabed, supported by steel frameworks, driven deep into sediment. Supply boats and tug vessels travel between these installations and the coast. Their routes are repetitive. Their work is procedural. Crews rotate in and out on scheduled assignments. The water here is warm compared to northern oceans. Surface temperatures often remain above 25 degrees Celsius. Weather can shift without warning, but most days pass in routine maritime labor. Engines hum, winches lift. Radios transmit short instructions. The tugboat Jaskin operated in these waters in May 2013. It was part of a fleet servicing offshore oil infrastructure. Tugboats of this class are not large ocean liners. They are compact, industrial vessels built for maneuvering, towing, and positioning heavier structures. Their hulls are reinforced. Their cabins are practical. Living quarters are tight. The Atlantic in this region does not present itself as dramatic. It is not icebound or visually hostile. It appears open and manageable. Yet depth increases quickly beyond the continental shelf. Below the surface lies cold darkness, heavy pressure, and silence. On the morning of the 26th of May 2013, operations continued as scheduled. Nothing outwardly suggested interruption. The Jaskin was owned by a Nigerian marine services company, contracted to support offshore oil operations in the Gulf of Guinea. Its role was functional. It towed equipment, stabilized floating structures, and assisted in positioning pipelines and platforms. The vessel was not designed for long transoceanic travel. It operated close to fixed installations, often returning to port between assignments. The crew on board reflected the structure of the regional maritime workforce. Most were Nigerian nationals, with experience in coastal and offshore labor. Their training levels varied by role. Some held formal maritime certifications. Others had learned through repeated contracts and time at sea. The hierarchy was clear. Officers handled navigation and operations. Ratings carried out mechanical, deck, and service duties. Among them was Harrison O'Keene. He was employed as the ship's cook. His responsibilities were contained within the galley and adjacent storage areas. He prepared meals for the crew, managed provisions, and maintained the kitchen space. His work followed a routine dictated by meal times rather than watch rotations. Unlike deckhands or engineers, he did not spend long hours exposed on open decks. O'Keene was born in Nigeria and had taken maritime work as a means of steady income. Offshore contracts offered higher pay than shore-based labor. The work was repetitive but reliable. Long stretches away from land were balanced by periods at home between jobs. For many workers in the region, this pattern was familiar. The Jaskin carried a full crew complement at the time of the incident. Living conditions were compact. Cabins were shared. Corridors were narrow. Movement through the vessel required familiarity with its layout. Emergency procedures were posted, but drills were infrequent compared to larger international shipping operations. On the 25th of May 2013, the tugboat was positioned near an offshore oil platform. Weather conditions were considered acceptable for continued operations. There were no recorded distress signals or reports of mechanical failure prior to the incident. The crew followed standard routines. Meals were prepared. Equipment checks were conducted. Navigation remained stable. As cook, O'Keene's day was structured around preparation and cleanup. The galley was located below deck, closer to the interior of the vessel. It was a confined space, insulated from external views of the sea. Sound traveled differently there. Engine vibrations were constant. The motion of the vessel was felt through the floor rather than seen. The crew had no indication that this assignment would differ from previous ones. The vessel was not engaged in an emergency maneuver. It was not attempting a high-risk operation. There was no evacuation order in place. No warnings were issued. The Jaskin remained afloat, operational and routine. Within hours, that condition would change permanently. In the early hours of the 26th of May 2013, the sea state began to shift. Weather in the Gulf of Guinea can change with little transition. Swells build without dramatic warning. Surface conditions may appear manageable until a single formation rises beyond the pattern. The Jaskin was operating near an offshore platform when a sudden wave struck the vessel broadside. Later reporting described it as a powerful swell rather than a named storm. There was no advance evacuation. No distress call was completed. The force of the water destabilized the tugboat. Tug vessels are built with strong hulls, but they have high superstructures relative to their size. When a wave strikes at the wrong angle, stability can be lost quickly. The impact rolled the vessel. Within moments, the tugboat overturned. Equipment broke loose. Interior compartments shifted violently. Lights failed as electrical systems flooded. Water forced its way through openings and ventilation routes. The inversion happened rapidly. Those on deck were thrown into open water. Those below deck experienced immediate disorientation as floors became ceilings. Harrison O'Kene was in a restroom when the vessel began to turn. The motion was abrupt. Fixtures tore away. Water entered the compartment. He later stated that he moved through the interior by instinct, searching for an area not yet fully submerged. The tugboat did not sink immediately to the seabed. It drifted inverted for a period before descending. Air trapped within sections of the hull prevented instant flooding of every compartment. But as the vessel settled, water pressure increased. Darkness replaced any remaining light. Crew members who had been unable to escape were now inside an overturned structure taking on water. The seafloor beneath that stretch of ocean lay approximately 30 meters below the surface. When the Jascon finally came to rest, it did so upside down. Above the wreck, the Atlantic resumed its surface rhythm. Below, movement stopped. The point of no return had already passed. When the Jascon settled on the seabed, it did so inverted, its hull resting against the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 30 meters. The descent was not violent in the way of an explosion or collision. It was heavy and final. Steel met sediment. The motion ceased. Inside the hull, sections remained partially sealed by trapped air. These pockets were irregular in shape and unstable in volume. Water had already filled much of the vessel. Corridors that once allowed upright passage were now submerged tunnels. The interior was dark. Electrical systems had failed during the capsize. There was no artificial light. Harrison O'Kene had moved through rising water during the inversion. He later described navigating by touch, following walls and door frames as gravity reversed his sense of direction. In an overturned vessel, orientation becomes unreliable. What had been overhead was now beneath him. What had been floor space became a sloping ceiling. He located a compartment where water had not yet fully displaced the air. The space was small. The ceiling, formerly the floor, angled unevenly. The air pocket was not dry. Water occupied much of the volume, leaving a limited column of breathable space above it. The temperature inside was determined by the surrounding ocean. At that depth, water temperatures were cooler than the surface, but not near freezing. Prolonged exposure still posed risk. The first condition he faced was shock. Capsizing introduces immediate physiological stress, rapid breathing, confusion, elevated heart rate. In confined space underwater, panic accelerates oxygen consumption. The trapped air was finite. Each breath altered its composition. There were no external sounds beyond muted pressure against the hull. The ocean at 30 meters absorbed surface noise. Inside the wreck, movement was restricted. Debris floated or shifted in slow motion within the water. The air pocket did not extend across the entire compartment. It was localized. He remained partly submerged, with water reaching chest height when standing against the inverted structure. Time became indistinct. In the early hours, survival required stabilization rather than action. There was no clear path to the surface. The vessel's exits were either blocked by water pressure or too distant to reach, without diving through submerged corridors in darkness. Visibility inside the wreck was nearly zero. Sediment stirred easily. Any attempt to swim blindly risked entanglement. O'Kene conserved movement. He remained within the air pocket. He avoided unnecessary exertion. The body cools more quickly in water than in air. Partial submersion, increased heat loss. He attempted to keep his upper body elevated to reduce exposure. The air itself presented another problem. In a sealed environment, oxygen levels gradually decline while carbon dioxide increases. The human body reacts strongly to elevated carbon dioxide. Headache, dizziness, and air hunger follow. The precise volume of trapped air in that compartment has not been publicly quantified. It was sufficient to delay complete oxygen depletion, but not stable. Hours passed. At some point, daylight returned at the surface above, though it did not penetrate to his location. There was no natural indicator of morning. Circadian rhythm was irrelevant. Survival depended on patience. He later reported locating a flashlight within the wreck. The device functioned intermittently. Battery life in such conditions is uncertain. Light allowed limited inspection of the compartment, but did not extend far into flooded sections. The beam reflected off suspended particles, reducing range. Food was minimal. As the ship's cook, he had access to provisions before the capsize, but once submerged, those supplies were largely inaccessible. He reportedly found a bottle of soda within reach. Liquid intake delayed dehydration, but did not address long-term needs. The most immediate threat remained air quality. He limited speech. He limited movement. He attempted controlled breathing. The body's instinct under confinement is to test boundaries, to search for exit points. In this case, exploration meant diving into black water within a metal structure lying upside down on the ocean floor. He did not attempt a full escape through submerged passages during those initial hours. Above the wreck, response procedures began. The capsizing had been observed at the surface. Rescue coordination focused first on personnel thrown into open water. The inverted hull remained visible before sinking fully. Once submerged, recovery shifted toward locating survivors and bodies. Divers would eventually be dispatched. Inside, Okene remained alone. As hours extended into a full day, physical strain accumulated. Prolonged standing in water increases fatigue. Muscles stiffen. Skin softens with immersion. The air pocket's size likely changed slightly as internal pressure equalized and minor leaks allowed gradual seepage. Any reduction in air volume increased stress. Psychological endurance became central. Confined survival events often produce alternating phases of alertness and detachment. Without external stimuli, the mind narrows focus to immediate sensory input: breath, temperature, sound. There were no visible crew members within his air pocket. Other compartments of the vessel had filled entirely. Some crew had escaped during the initial capsize. Others had not. He remained in darkness for extended intervals. The human body can survive without food for days, but oxygen availability governs minutes and hours. At 30 meters depth, external water pressure measured roughly 4 atmospheres absolute. The trapped air within the hull would have compressed during descent, reducing its original surface volume. This compression partially explains why a relatively small pocket could sustain limited breathing space while the vessel rested on the seabed. At some point during the second day, he heard faint external noises. These were not clear voices, but impacts against the hull. Rescue teams had located the wreck. Divers initiated recovery operations, expecting fatalities rather than survivors. Standard maritime procedure in such cases prioritizes retrieval. He could not know the timeline above him. Sound transmission underwater differs from air. Vibrations travel through metal effectively. The hull carried dull thuds and scraping movements. He struck surfaces in response, attempting to signal. Energy conservation conflicted with signaling effort. Striking metal required force. Each movement increased respiration. The balance between being heard and preserving oxygen was narrow. Hours continued. Exposure to cold water over prolonged duration can lead to hypothermia, even in moderate temperatures. Shivering increases metabolic demand and oxygen use. He attempted to remain as still as possible, reducing heat loss by minimizing contact area. During this period, he likely experienced progressive dehydration, limited access to freshwater compounds, physical weakness. The bottle of soda he located provided temporary relief but not sustained hydration. Carbon dioxide accumulation would have altered air quality perceptibly. High concentrations cause a sensation of suffocation even when oxygen remains present. The body responds with deeper, faster breaths, which in turn accelerate oxygen depletion. Maintaining controlled breathing under such conditions requires deliberate effort. Time inside the air pocket eventually exceeded 24 hours. The surface response transitioned into organized diving operations. A South African salvage company was contracted to conduct underwater recovery. Divers descended to the wreck with the expectation of retrieving bodies. Inside the inverted hull, conditions had stabilized only in the sense that they were static. Water levels did not significantly recede. Air volume did not meaningfully expand. The environment remained dark, cold, and enclosed. By the second night, though, night and day had no distinction below. Okene remained alive. He later stated that he prayed during this time. That statement is part of the documented record. There is no transcript of his internal thoughts. There were no witnesses within the compartment. On the third day after the capsizing, divers entered the wreck. The first diver navigated through submerged corridors, equipped with helmet-mounted light and breathing apparatus. The mission profile assumed recovery, not rescue. Movement through an overturned vessel requires caution. Debris, cables, and unstable partitions pose hazards. Visibility is limited by silt disturbance. As the diver approached interior compartments, his light beam cut through suspended particles. The hull's geometry was unfamiliar in inversion. He progressed methodically. Within one compartment, the diver's light encountered movement. A hand reached from the darkness. The diver recoiled briefly, then regained position. The figure was alive. After approximately 60 hours underwater within an air pocket, Harrison Okene had survived. The diver who first saw movement inside the wreck had entered expecting recovery of bodies. The operation had already located several deceased crew members within flooded compartments. Standard maritime assessment after a capsizing of that duration did not anticipate survivors. The interior of the inverted Jascon had become a submerged structure. Furniture, equipment, and personal effects rested against ceilings that had once been floors. In adjacent compartments, crew members, who had been unable to escape during the capsize, were found where water had filled completely. Their bodies remained suspended or lodged within confined spaces. Recovery required careful maneuvering to avoid entanglement. Harrison Okene remained within the air pocket he had occupied since the sinking. By the time divers reached him, he had endured nearly 3 days in partial submersion. His body temperature had declined. His skin had been exposed to salt water for prolonged duration. Dehydration had advanced. He later reported that his tongue was swollen and his throat dry. The air pocket had diminished. Divers measured the space visually. It was limited and unstable. Carbon dioxide concentration was likely elevated, though exact levels were not formally published. His survival duration exceeded common expectations for trapped air supply in maritime sinkings at that depth. Outside the hull, recovery teams continued systematic retrieval of the deceased. 11 crew members were confirmed dead. The event had shifted from rescue to salvage within hours of the capsizing. Insurance procedures, corporate investigation, and maritime reporting processes were already underway. Inside the wreck, time had narrowed to immediate extraction. Okene's physical state restricted rapid movement. He had limited strength and had been immersed in water for most of the period. Divers needed to transition him from the air pocket into open water while managing ascent risks. At 30 meters depth, decompression becomes medically relevant. A direct ascent without staged decompression can cause nitrogen bubbles to form in the bloodstream, leading to decompression sickness. Because he had been breathing compressed air within a high-pressure environment, his body had absorbed nitrogen consistent with depth exposure. Divers fitted him with a spare breathing apparatus and guided him through submerged corridors toward the exit. The dead ship remained silent as they moved. Extraction required control rather than speed. Divers secured Harrison O'Kane with a breathing mask and guided him from the air pocket into fully submerged passageways. For the first time, in nearly 60 hours, he entered open water beyond the confined space where he had remained. Movement through the overturned hull was deliberate. The structure was unstable. Loose material drifted in slow suspension. The diver ahead maintained orientation using guidelines and practiced navigation techniques common in salvage operations. Once outside the wreck, ascent did not proceed directly to the surface. Because O'Kane had remained at depth for an extended period, his body required decompression management. Divers transported him to a diving bell positioned at a controlled depth. From there, he was transferred to a decompression chamber aboard the recovery vessel. He remained inside the chamber for several days. Medical teams monitored his condition for symptoms associated with prolonged submersion and pressure exposure. He survived without major long-term physical injury. At the surface, the Atlantic continued its routine movement. The wreck of the Gascon remained on the seabed. The capsizing of the Gascon in May 2013 resulted in the confirmed deaths of 11 crew members. One survived. Harrison O'Kane later returned to land and spoke publicly about the experience. Maritime safety investigators reviewed the incident within the context of offshore operating risk and vessel stability. The event became a documented case study in survival under pressure and confined air entrapment. The wreck remained beneath the Gulf of Guinea for a period before further salvage operations. Survival in such conditions was not the product of strength or defiance. It was a convergence of air volume, depth, timing, and restraint. Below the surface, the ocean preserves its silence. Above it, routine resumes.